I didn't come to my father's funeral to mourn. I came to file a lawsuit right at the cemetery gate. Because for me, this wasn't a family, it was a crime scene. They say a funeral is a time for remembrance, for closure, a moment to honor the departed and find peace. But for me, standing here, under this cold, gray sky, this isn't an ending. It's the beginning. The beginning of a reckoning. 15 years ago, my own father sold me. Not for cash, not on an auction block, but in a far more cruel and modern way. He traded my future, my identity, my birthright, for a fresh start with a new family, a shiny new life that didn't include me. He made a choice, and today, standing over his grave, I'm here to collect the consequences of that choice. This isn't just about money or revenge. It's about reclaiming a name, a legacy, a life that was stolen. If you've ever felt like the forgotten one in your family, the one whose dreams were sacrificed for someone else's convenience, then this space is for you. Subscribe and join others who know that quiet revenge is still a powerful form of justice. My mom passed when I was 11, and for a few years, it was just Dad and me, running the antique shop we'd built together from the ground up. He taught me everything. How to spot a genuine artifact from a fake, how to haggle with a customer, how to see the stories hidden in every item. This shop was our world. But that world ended the day he remarried. Her name was Candace, and she came with 2 kids, Wyatt and Lily. Suddenly, our life of dusty treasures and quiet history wasn't enough. They wanted something new, something modern. They wanted a life in the suburbs, a shiny new house, a 2-car garage. I was told these things would make them a family, but I quickly learned it was just the opposite. One afternoon, Dad sat me down, his face a mix of false sincerity and shame. He told me the antique shop was going to be sold. "It's for the best, Amelia," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Wyatt and Lily need stability. They need a proper home, not a dusty old store." He sold the legacy my mother had helped build, the one he had promised to me, for a suburban McMansion. That day, he didn't just sell our family business. He sold a piece of my soul. I watched as the life we built was handed over to strangers. And I watched as my father, my partner, my protector, became someone I didn't recognize. If this story hit you hard, don't forget to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm these stories matter, and it tells me to keep going. "Amelia," he said, his voice a weak and hollow echo of the man I used to know. "This is a sacrifice for your future. I'll use the money from the shop to put you through a great college. This is just a detour, a chance for you to see the world before you come back home to us." He spoke of a prestigious university, a life of opportunity, and a family that would be waiting for me. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. I needed to think that the father who had taught me to trust was still there, somewhere beneath the surface. I packed a small bag, a worn photo album, and a broken heart, and stepped into the world alone. I would spend the next few years working 2 jobs just to make ends meet, living in a tiny apartment, all while clinging to his promise like a lifeline. But every call I made went unanswered. Every text, every letter was met with silence. A cold, deafening silence that told me everything I needed to know. The promise wasn't a promise. It was a lie, a cheap excuse to get me out of the picture. The money he got from the shop, our legacy, wasn't for me. It was for them. It was for the new house, the new cars, the new lives he was building with his new family. It was a cruel, calculated deception, and with every day that passed, my faith in him was replaced with a bitter truth. I wasn't a detour. I was a discarded remnant. A piece of the past he had no room for in his shiny, new future. You know, the world can break you, but it can also forge you. For 2 years, I worked, I studied, and I scraped by. But the fire inside me wasn't about survival anymore. It was about justice. The promise of college was a lie, but the paperwork, that was the truth. It turns out, my father's new wife was so eager to finalize the deal that she overlooked a few details. I found them buried in the fine print of the sales contract, a series of legal loopholes and minor breaches that were just waiting to be exploited. It was a single, tiny clause about shared ownership and inheritance rights that gave me a glimmer of hope. It was my mother's signature on a separate trust document, a legacy they thought they had erased. This wasn't just a simple case of a family falling apart. It was a complex family revenge story that had been written long before I was ever born. My plan was simple, and in its cold, meticulous way, it was perfect. I wasn't going to beg for a handout or confront them in an emotional outburst. I was going to use their own greed against them. I was going to leverage the very system they thought would protect them and turn it into a weapon. My first move was to find a lawyer who would believe me, who would see not just a sob story, but a winning case. If you've ever had to fight for your own worth, this space is for you. Subscribe and join others who know that quiet revenge is still power. I spent weeks searching for an attorney, facing one closed door after another. Most saw me as just another kid with a sob story, or worse, a vengeful daughter trying to shake down her own family. They saw the money, not the injustice. But then I found Alex. He was young, fresh out of law school, working in a tiny office on the less glamorous side of downtown. He didn't have a big firm name or a fancy title, but he had something far more valuable. He had a spark in his eyes that told me he believed in the fight. I laid out the whole ugly truth for him, the antique shop, the false promise, the twisted family dynamics. I showed him the crumpled contract, pointing out the subtle missteps and the loopholes. Alex didn't just listen, he absorbed every word. He saw the cold, calculated betrayal that was hidden beneath the surface of what seemed like a simple family feud. He saw the legal ground I had, and he saw the moral high ground I stood on. He looked at me and said, "This isn't just about money, is it, Amelia? This is about what's right." In that moment, he became more than just a lawyer, he became an ally. He was my first real glimpse of hope since the day I was left behind, a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, the world wasn't entirely made of people who would take advantage of you. He took the case pro bono, telling me he believed in a fight for justice, not just for a paycheck. We began to build our case, piece by piece, document by document, ready to tear down the empire my father had built on my back. Our legal battle began, and it was swift and brutal. We filed a lawsuit against my father and Candace, not for a simple sum of money, but to legally reclaim the antique shop and its inventory, citing the breached clauses in the original sales agreement. The legal argument was simple. They had failed to maintain the business as a going concern as stipulated in the contract, and had instead liquidated the assets for personal gain. This was the opening we needed. I wasn't a silent victim anymore. With Alex's guidance, I went to the press. I shared my story, not with a tearful plea, but with cold, hard facts. I laid out the timeline of my abandonment, the false promises, and the way my family's legacy was sold off like old furniture. My father didn't just sell a business, I told a reporter. He sold the only future I had, all for a fresh start with a new family. The story went viral on local news, and the headline, "The Father Who Sold His Daughter's Birthright," became a sensation. Suddenly, my father and Candace were no longer just a family living a quiet suburban life. They were pariahs. They were confronted at their new home and work, their shiny new life tarnished by the very truth they had tried to bury. My family revenge story was no longer a secret, and the world was watching. The lawsuit didn't just challenge the contract, it challenged their entire facade. Candace's carefully constructed life began to crumble. She was publicly shamed and ultimately fired from her job. The suburban dream house, once a symbol of their new beginning, became a cage of public scrutiny. The pressure was immense. My father, who had once been so eager to cast me aside, couldn't handle the weight of his own actions. He was a man built on weak foundations, and the legal battle was the earthquake that finally brought him down. One afternoon, during a tense mediation, he collapsed. He had a severe heart attack, right there in the law office. The paramedics arrived, but it was too late. He was gone. His death wasn't a victory. It was an empty silence, a final curtain on a play of my own making. I had won the lawsuit. The court ruled in my favor, awarding me the full proceeds from the sale of the antique shop, plus damages. But the victory felt hollow. I had set out to reclaim my life, and I had, but in the process, I had also become a part of a tragedy. If you're watching this and you've ever had to fight for what's yours, and you know the victory can sometimes feel bittersweet, type the state you're watching from in the comments below. Let's see how far this silent strength reaches. Winning the lawsuit was just the first layer of this family revenge story. After Dad's death, I found a box of old financial documents he'd kept hidden. As I pieced them together, a more sinister truth emerged. It wasn't just about selling the shop, it was about covering up. It turned out, my father was in a mountain of debt, a debt he'd been hiding from me for years. Candace, his new wife, had known this. She'd manipulated him, promising to save him from his financial ruin, but only if he signed over everything to her. The money from the antique shop wasn't for their new life, it was to pay off her own secret debts. My inheritance had been used as collateral for her mistakes, leaving my father a broken man. But the real twist? In his final, desperate days, he'd used his last remaining assets to take out loans in Candace's and her children's names, leaving them with an equal burden of debt. He may have sold me, but in his final moments, he made sure they would pay the price for it. It was a cold, calculated act of his own twisted justice. I now had the money from the lawsuit, but I also had the power to let their house of cards fall. I watched from a distance, knowing they had no idea what was coming for them. The world may have seen me as the heartless daughter, but they had no idea of the quiet storm I was about to unleash. The world loves a good fall from grace, and my father's new family gave them a front row seat. With the lawsuit behind me, I had no obligation to step in. I watched from afar as their carefully built life crumbled under the weight of the debt my father had left behind. Wyatt, who was used to getting everything he wanted, spiraled into addiction as the stress mounted. Lily, the so-called princess, had to drop out of her expensive private college and get a low-wage job just to help make ends meet. The beautiful suburban house, the very thing they sacrificed me for, was put into foreclosure. They had lost everything, not because of me directly, but because of the web of greed and deceit they had woven for themselves. They reached out, of course. Not with an apology, but with a desperate plea for help. Amelia, your father left us with nothing. Candace's voice choked over the phone. I hung up. I knew this was their karma, a silent, powerful consequence of their own actions. I had won the legal battle, but this was the true victory. The quiet, inescapable realization that their false life was a ticking time bomb. Let me know. Were you ever the scapegoat too? Type savior if you were always the fixer, or star if you were always the golden child. I want to see the balance. Then came the unexpected meeting. It wasn't a planned confrontation, no dramatic showdown in a fancy restaurant. It was just a cold afternoon in a public park. I saw Wyatt from a distance, and for a moment, the girl who once watched over him felt a pang of something close to pity. But the woman I had become quickly suppressed it. He looked up, his eyes hollow, and his voice was a ghost of what it used to be. Amelia, he said, and the name felt foreign on his lips. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for help. He just said, I'm sorry. Just 2 words, but they were the 2 words I never thought I would hear. He confessed that he'd seen the way my father and his mother treated me, that he'd been too young and selfish to speak up. He was now a ghost of his former self. This wasn't the vengeance I had envisioned. I thought seeing them suffer would bring me peace, but instead, it left me empty. The guilt had become his punishment, a silent, festering wound that had destroyed him from the inside out. I didn't say anything, and I didn't need to. His apology was the ultimate surrender, the final piece of my quiet family revenge story. And in that moment, I realized my anger wasn't just at them, but at the naive girl I used to be. The one who believed the lies. I stood there for a long time after he left. The empty feeling didn't go away. The truth is, vengeance, no matter how sweet it seems, doesn't fill the hole left by betrayal. For years, I had held on to my anger like it was my most valuable possession. It fueled me, it drove me, but it also weighed me down. When I saw Wyatt and his hollow eyes, I realized that my family's tragedy wasn't just my story to tell, it was also his. The silent strength that I had once used as a shield against their actions was now holding me captive. I knew that to truly move on, I had to let go of the pain. I began to find a different kind of purpose. I established a foundation in my mother's name, dedicated to helping at-risk youth and children from broken families, the ones who get left behind in messy divorces and power struggles. I used the money I had won from the lawsuit to give them a second chance, to ensure they wouldn't have to face the same struggles I did. It was a way to turn my personal tragedy into a source of hope, to build something new from the ashes of my past. It was through helping others that I began to heal myself. This wasn't about forgiveness for them. It was about liberation for me. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I've learned it's a dish that leaves you hungry for something more. My journey wasn't about winning a lawsuit or watching my family fall. It was about finding my way back to myself. The day I stood at my father's grave, I was a girl burdened by the weight of the past. But today, I stand here as a woman who has found her own strength. This is my truth, and it's not a story of a heartless daughter, but a story of a silent survivor. It's about how the deepest wounds can teach you the greatest lessons. My life isn't defined by what was taken from me, but by what I chose to build with what was left. So, if you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Don't let anyone else's choices define your worth. You have the power to write your own chapter, to build your own legacy, and to find your own peace, far away from the shadows of your past. The world may never know what you've been through, but we do. Subscribe if these stories speak your truth. And together, we can continue to share the stories of those who, against all odds, chose to rise from the ashes.